Let us praise with songs, sacred songs, the Holy Apostle Luke, recorder of the joyous gospel of Christ, scribe of the Acts of the Apostles, for his writings are a testimony of the Church of Christ. He is the physician of human weaknesses and infirmities. He heals the wounds of our souls and constantly intercedes for our salvation. This is the hymn of St. Luke that we commemorate today, October 18th, in the church calendar. And Luke is a very important figure and one that there is much to be learned about still. There's that which we know, and there are many mysteries surrounding him as well. But he is, most importantly, a wonderful illustration of the gospel in action. And so let's today, as we commemorate St. Luke, really ponder his life and his role in the life of the church. So who was he? Well, according to tradition, we believe he was born in Syria, perhaps in Antioch, the great city where the people who were called Christians first got that name. Now, he is named in only 3 places in the New Testament as a fellow laborer and companion of St. Paul. But all of the early authorities, all the early lists of the Gospels and so forth attribute this Gospel to Luke. And there are no competing traditions or alternate views that exist in the ancient world of which we know. And also, likewise, he is considered the author of the Acts of the Apostles, and there seems to be no reason to doubt that either. Now, most sources assume that Luke was a Gentile by birth, mainly because of the reading we had today, Colossians chapter 4. In verses 7 through 11, he is not included in the list of St. Paul when he says, "These are my only fellow workers for the kingdom of God who are of the circumcision." But that doesn't necessarily mean that nobody else he lists after that point in the epistle are thereby not Jewish. It just might mean that the ones in Rome, the community in Rome, these were the only Jews in Rome that joined him to become fellow laborers in the vineyard, because Luke isn't from Rome, and this was written in Rome. He's mentioned in a later verse, Luke, the beloved physician. And he's a physician. There are many arguments that show that he is well-educated and so forth. And so he might be a Jew. He might be a Hellenized Jew, a Jew who was born outside of Judea. Or he might be a proselyte, a Gentile by birth, but one who became a Jew. Why do I bring this up? Because there's also some very important and compelling arguments that would say he is a Jew. One, he's extremely familiar with the Hebrew Scriptures, or at least the Septuagint Scriptures, which makes the argument for him being Hellenized, or a Greek-speaking Jew. 2, he has a very powerful familiarity with things that only somebody in Jerusalem might know. The temple, the priestly life. In fact, one scholar in Australia in 2008 wrote a whole book arguing that Luke might have in fact been a priest or from the priestly line. And perhaps the most compelling argument is simply that if Luke is not a Jew, he would be the only author of a book in the Bible who is not Jewish, including the New Testament. And while the spirit of inclusivity and generosity makes us say, well, that would be wonderful, right? God included somebody who was not Jewish. That would go against everything and up to that point. And so it kind of looks a little, not so sure about that. So there's lots of reasons. Now, the church has traditionally numbered Luke among the 70 apostles, those who were sent by Christ 2 by 2 before him to the various cities that he himself would then later visit. And they came back to him, as we just read, and they said, "Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name." And he said, "That's great, but remember, it's better that your names are written in the book of life and your names are kept in heaven." And if Luke is one of the 70, then by definition he's going to have to be a Jew, because they were all Jews. He would not have been able to, the Gentiles had yet to receive the gospel, and that was only in the book of Acts. So it's a very interesting mystery to us. But in any case, what we can see is that where Luke is mentioned, he's never mentioned in isolation or alone, but it's always in the context of this growing community of the church, which includes both Jews and Gentiles. And of course, Luke's gospel is the one that is most outreaching, if you will, to the Gentile community. It talks the most positively about Gentiles and includes them as characters and parts of the story, that the people that encountered Christ as Gentiles. Now, in the epistles of St. Paul, where he is actually mentioned by name, he's mentioned at these points that are usually at the end of the epistles, where St. Paul gives a whole list of greetings or recommendations or commendations to people who are in the church. Greet so-and-so, or so-and-so greets you. Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. And this shows us that the church was very organic, very personal. And that is how the faith spread. Remember, at this point in the life of the church, there were no gospels written. All they had were direct personal relationships with the apostles, with those who had known Christ and come to know Christ. And of course, Paul, as we heard in the Epistle to the Galatians, makes this point. I received also the revelation just as much as the apostles did. I received it directly from Christ, and I didn't just study under the feet of Peter or James, though I did meet them, and I did spend some time with them. But he himself considers himself equal to the apostles, as we mentioned, I think it was last week or the week before. And it was not until those persons who personally encountered Christ, the 12 apostles, the 70 and so forth, and even Paul, were put to death and began to disappear from the earth, that the church said, hey, we need to record this. We need to have this written down. We're losing them. This was the first kind of oral histories, if you will. And it was the same motivation. We're losing these people. We need to save this. And so St. Luke comes forward after the death of Paul to write his gospel, writes it very specifically with a historical method, one of the very first early people that we can say attempts to approach things with a historiographical approach. And that's very important. Now, St. Paul was martyred in the time of Nero in the mid-60s. That's AD 66 about, not 1960, 66. That would be very fresh and very different. And so in this case, it also helps us answer a question, which came first, the Bible or the church? Well, if you talk about the New Testament, very clearly, the New Testament is this collection of books and epistles that were written by people in the church, for people in the church, to people in the church. So the church existed before the New Testament. The New Testament came along to record what the church had been doing. And as I said, St. Luke is always mentioned in the context of these people, the people of the church, as a group of a community of believers and fellow laborers. These, in particular, in all three places that he's named in the New Testament, he's always named in conjunction or right next to two others, Mark and Demas. Mark you probably know. Mark is a fellow evangelist, the author of the Gospel of St. Mark, or John Mark, as he's also known. But this fellow named Demas, we don't really know much about him at all, except what's written in those three little verses. Demas might be short for Demetrius. We're not sure. He was from Thessalonica, and of course later there was St. Demetrius in Thessalonica, but that doesn't follow necessarily. In Philemon, a short letter of St. Paul, he writes, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, greets you, as do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, Luke, my fellow laborers. Now, Epaphras and Aristarchus, if you were listening, you just heard them mentioned in the letter to the Colossians. They were Paul's fellow prisoners. So they were co-suffering with Paul in the prison in Rome when he wrote these epistles. And so they had a very close connection with each other. When I read this, again, I was reminded of the 7 Words movie, which we recently watched here, about the life of Father Calciu, and how one of the fellow prisoners that had been incarcerated with him in the communist prison spoke, we had a brotherhood. There was a bond between us. And it's something truly mystical, because those who have endured incredible hardships and great suffering together with one another, they do have a connection with one another that's hard to understand. It can't even be vocalized, really. And so St. Paul has those people who are his peers, who suffered with him all the way to the end and experienced these things together with him. But then they also have these other fellow laborers, those who were outside the prison, who were continuing the work of ministry on behalf of St. Paul and on behalf of the church. And these are people like Mark, Demas, and Luke. Now, Mark, or John Mark, is the spiritual son of St. Peter. And he is the cousin of Paul's early traveling companion and fellow missionary, Barnabas. A lot of names I'm throwing at you today. There will be a quiz at the end. Now, John Mark had a good start and then a falling out with St. Paul. Why? Because they were traveling together and he was coming along and kind of mentoring under Barnabas and doing well as a fellow missionary. But when they traveled from Cyprus to Asia Minor, Mark said, guys, I gotta go. I'm going back to Jerusalem. I'll see you later. And Paul was very upset about this. He said, this man has left us when there was work to be done. And after that, it seems that he kind of resented John Mark and he didn't consider him to be reliable. And so later, when Barnabas and Paul are talking about going on another mission, Barnabas says, let's bring John Mark. Let's do it. And Paul says, no way. I can't trust that guy. He left us before. He might leave us in the lurch again. Find somebody else. And Barnabas is adamant. It's my cousin. What are you talking about? Right? And it says in Acts 15, the contention was so sharp that they parted company. Paul and Barnabas, who were these close partners in missionary work, walked no more together. And so Paul went off with Silas, and Barnabas went off with John Mark. And so it's a very kind of human revelation of who the apostles were. You know, we like to think, oh, they're in the Bible, so they must be holy people, and holy people never have kind of feelings that we have, and they never sin, or they never do. Well, you know, Paul struggled, obviously. He resented. And he got mad. And he badmouthed Mark later because he had not gone with them to the work. And so perhaps Paul thought of John Mark in terms similar to the Lord's parable that we also heard today in Luke 8. The ones who fell on the rock, the seed that fell on the rock. And the Lord says, the ones on the rock are those who, when they hear, receive the word with joy, but these have no root, who believe for a while and in time of temptation fall away. So maybe Paul thought of Mark as somebody who, well, he started good, but when it got hard and when there was work to do, you know, he'd rather go home, back to his home community and his home church, and back to Peter, where he knew he would be kind of a little bit easier life, right? Now, thankfully, by the end, St. Paul reconciled with Mark. And we read in 2 Timothy that he says to Timothy, get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for my ministry. And in Colossians, as we just read, if he comes to you, John Mark that is, welcome him. So by the end of his life, Paul is recommending John Mark, and he's recognizing his value, and he's gotten over whatever it was that he was mad at him about. Perhaps the 4 years that he spent in prison, 2 in Caesarea Philippi or Caesarea Judea, and then the 2 years that he spent in Rome, maybe that mellowed his personality a little bit. And he learned a little patience. But in any case, by the end he forgave Mark and was willing to work with him and continued that way. And that's a beautiful thing. Thank God for the forgiveness of St. Paul. Can you imagine if he had gone on the rest of his life saying no thanks? Mark's gospel is the foundation of all the other gospels, the synoptic gospels at least. And Luke borrowed heavily from him, as did Matthew. So we'd be without the gospels if Paul had stuck to his resentment. Thank God for his forgiveness. Now, young master. Now we know much less about Demas, right? You probably never heard of him until today unless you read those 3 little verses. Who's Demas? What does he have to do with it? And he started off very promising. He's listed among the fellow laborers with Mark and Aristarchus and Luke. He's on par with them. And he sends his greetings to the church of the Colossians with Luke, the beloved physician. But by the end of those prison years, something had happened. Paul is a little less joyful. He's beginning to feel the weight of this imprisonment. He says, remember me in my chains, right? Remember my chains. Be diligent to come to me quickly. And so he writes to St. Timothy with great sadness, it seems. He says, be diligent to come to me quickly, because Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and has departed for Thessalonica. Crescens to Galatia, Titus for Dalmatia, only Luke is with me. It's sad. Only Luke is left. I'm all alone here. Everybody's left me. And just as Paul seemed to resent Mark for departing at a time of need, he now seems likewise to be somewhat unhappy with Demas, right? Now, Crescens and Titus apparently left to do some work. Perhaps he doesn't give them any grief. But for Demas, he says, he left me having forsaken me. He deserted me. So that's strong words. Chrysostom paraphrases this verse as follows. He says, having loved ease and safety, Demas chose rather to live daintily at home than to suffer affliction, than to endure hardship with me, and with me to bear these present dangers. And so this reminds us of the second type described in the Lord's parable. When he says, the ones that fell among thorns are those who, when they have heard, go out, but are choked with cares, riches, and pleasures of life, and bring no fruit to maturity. Whatever happened to Demas in Thessalonica, we do not know, but he is not remembered among the saints. We do not know of any fruit that he brought to maturity by his choice, by his action. And it's a sad way to have your immortality, right? To have your name remembered forever as a deserter, which is exactly what it is because of this. Now, only Luke is with me, he says. This reminds us then of the final testimonial of his character. He is a steadfast friend. He is a companion. And as far as we know, he did not leave Paul until either the apostle was released from his imprisonment at Rome or ended in martyrdom. The book of Acts leaves us at a cliffhanger with him being in prison, but doesn't say what happened. According to one tradition, he was able to get out, make his desired trip to Spain that he wrote about, and then came back to Rome and was killed, or he just stayed in Rome and was killed there. We're not 100% sure. But Luke becomes an example for us of the living third type mentioned in the parable. But the ones that fell on the good ground are those who, having heard the word with a noble and good heart, keep it and bear fruit with patience. So Luke remains steadfast. He remains close to Paul. He follows him through his difficulties. And as a result, he's able to bring great fruit. Now, brothers and sisters, each one of us can take a moment and see how we reflect the gospel in our own lives, this parable of the good sower and the good seeds, in the context of our relationships to other people. Because that's where the church grows. That's where the faith is spread. So the parable has everything to do with human relationships. If our human relationships don't reflect this reality that we see happening in Luke and later in Mark, then we are not fulfilling that. How do we treat our fellow Christians? How do we contribute to the church? And we can start with our friends, whether they're in the church or not, because how we treat people in the church or outside the church should not be different. If it is, that's a problem of consistency of character. But how do we treat our friends? Are we really little more than acquaintances with some of them? We enjoy hanging out with them until there's some demand that is made upon us or some level of effort we're not willing to put into the relationship? Do we enjoy their friendship as long as we're not the ones who have to make the plans, the reservations, do the legwork, the research, make decisions? Are we along for the ride? Or do we not listen to the other people and just tell them what to do? Are we good at replying to texts and emails, but never bother to pick up the phone ourselves and lend a human voice to the relationship and start a conversation ourselves? I fear for our young people. They are, and I mean like the teenagers and younger. They don't know how to talk as human beings anymore. They know how to do this. And that's what they do. And they have incredible, meaningful relationships over text messages. That's not real. They don't know it. That's all they know. It's so sad for them. Are we willing to work in our relationships as long as they do not prevent us from enjoying ourselves and the worldly comforts that we know? Do we withdraw from a friend when that friend isn't that much fun anymore? Maybe they got sick, or maybe they're depressed, or maybe they lost their job and they don't have as much money to go out and do things. Maybe they're going through some kind of trouble that we kind of feel embarrassed by. We don't necessarily know if we want to be around them. Where are we with them when they are down? Do we always have a good excuse of doing something else when a friend is in need and asks us? How many of us have helped somebody move lately? That's a sign of a friendship. Or are we like Luke, the steadfast companion? Do we stand by the side of a friend even when they're not at their best? Even when they don't particularly deserve to be loved? Or they don't deserve to have our friendship? They haven't done anything for us in a long time. Do we still have patience with them? Do we still love them? When a friend is sick or sad or unsettled, do we step forward and let them know they are loved and that we are there to help them concretely with real action and activity? Lastly, do we do this in the church as a whole for one another? The Lord said, "By this all men will know that you are my disciples, that you love one another." And when he says that you love one another, he's not saying that you like one another, or that you feel love in your heart for one another, but that you love one another, that you act on that love, that you take the actions of love concretely, demonstrably, significantly. That's what we need to ask. Where is the seed bearing fruit in our relationships with one another? Is it just words? Is it just acquaintances and not real friendship? Is it just something we do once a week and then forget the rest? Brothers and sisters, let us take from St. Luke this model of friendship and cultivate that friendship as the seed needs to be cultivated in us. This is how the gospel becomes actualized in our life, in our relationships. Not through reading of books, not through long night vigils, okay? Through the relationships with one another, through which that love is expressed. That's our love. We love him too. Don't look at him with anything but love. He's good that he's here. Some of us are not here as much as we need to be, or when we need to be. So brothers and sisters, God bless you through the prayers of the holy apostle and evangelist Luke. Amen.